The barn doors had not opened in years. That was the first thing Nora Hale noticed when she stepped out of her truck and stood in the gray afternoon light, looking at what she had just spent the last of her money on. 30 acres of frozen ground, a collapsing wooden barn the size of a small church, and a rusted trailer sitting out front like an afterthought, like something someone had meant to move and simply never did. The wind came across the open land without warning. It hit her full in the face, and she didn't flinch. She had learned in the past year not to flinch at things that hurt. Eli climbed down from the passenger seat and stood beside her, his small hands buried in his coat pockets. He looked at the barn. He looked at the trailer. He looked up at his mother. He didn't say anything. He had stopped asking questions months ago, and that silence worried her more than any question ever could. "It's ours," Nora said quietly. Not to convince him, to convince herself. But before we go any further, before the cold sets in and the lights go out across that valley, there is something you need to know. Something that happened before the barn doors opened that final night. Before the wind reached temperatures that turned breath to ice in seconds. Before the people who had laughed at her, reported her, and tried to take her son came crawling through the dark with nowhere else to go. Picture this: a woman standing in a doorway, lantern light warm behind her, the storm screaming outside like a living thing. And on the other side of that door, the man who had spent 3 months trying to destroy her, his coat frozen stiff, his pride in pieces. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she stepped aside. That was Nora Hale, 42 years old, a woman who had lost nearly everything and built something extraordinary from what remained. But here is what made that night so extraordinary. What she had built inside that barn was a secret that could still, even then, even after everything, be used to take her son away. And there was something else, something hidden beneath the floorboards of that old barn when she first arrived. A notebook, worn leather cover, handwriting she recognized the moment she saw it, though she had not seen it in many years. The name on the inside cover stopped her cold. It was her father's handwriting, and what was written inside those pages would not just help her survive the winter, it would reveal the truth about who had taken everything from her family, and why she had been drawn back to this land as if the ground itself had called her home. But that answer would have to wait, because first there was the matter of survival. The divorce had been the kind that leaves marks on more than one person. Not the quiet, private unraveling that some marriages do, but the public kind. The kind shaped by a man who knew how to use legal systems the way other people use weapons. By the time the proceedings were finished, Nora had very little left. The savings were gone. The house was gone. Her reputation in the city she had called home for 15 years, gone too, shaped by a story she had no power to correct. What remained was Eli, 9 years old, dark-eyed and serious in the way that children become when they have witnessed too much adult grief up close. And there was the matter of the hearing. Her husband's lawyers had already begun building their case. The argument was simple and devastating. Nora had no stable home to offer the boy, no permanent address, no reliable income. The trailer, they would say, was no place to raise a child through winter. And winter, in that part of the country, was not something you debated. She had 4 months before the hearing date, 4 months to prove that Eli was safe, that she was capable, that she had not simply broken apart and taken her son into the wreckage with her. That barn held the only answer she could afford. What the town saw was something different. They saw a woman from the city who had paid almost nothing for a property that nobody wanted, because nobody with any sense would want it. They saw the rusted trailer. They saw the overgrown fields. They saw a 42-year-old woman with a quiet child and no visible plan, and they made their judgments quickly, the way small towns do. Wyatt Greer made his judgment loudest of all. He was a land developer, the kind who had spent years quietly reshaping the edges of that valley, buying low and building fast, always watching for the next opportunity. He had wanted the old property, had assumed it would come to him eventually, as neglected things tend to do. When Nora outbid him, with a number that surprised even her, he took it personally. He began making calls. Nothing dramatic, nothing traceable, just conversations over coffee, questions raised at the right moments, a quiet word here and there about permits and codes, and the structural integrity of abandoned agricultural buildings. Pressure without fingerprints. Marvel Doss was only too happy to assist. She drove past the property every few days, noting what she saw, reporting back. The trailer never seemed quite right to her. The barn sat too quiet. Something, she told anyone who would listen, was not adding up. What neither of them knew, what no one in that town knew, was what Nora was doing after dark. The trucks came late, always after 10. They backed up to the far side of the barn, away from the road, and the deliveries were quick and silent. Steel components, curved, heavy, each piece numbered, each piece part of a design Nora had studied for weeks before she ever signed a single document. A Quonset structure. Steel arches that would bolt together into a curved shell, 20 feet wide, 40 feet long, strong enough to hold weight that would make the old barn walls tremble. Insulated, sealed, hidden inside the rotting wooden frame of the original building like a living heart inside a hollow chest. She worked by flashlight when she had to. Eli helped where he could, holding pieces steady, handing her tools, watching her hands with the careful attention of a child who understands, without being told, that everything depends on getting this right. Scout found them on the third week. He appeared at the edge of the barn one evening, a thin dog, pale-coated, ribs showing through his fur. He sat down at a careful distance and simply watched. Eli saw him first and went very still, the way he had learned to go still around things he wanted badly, but was afraid to want. "Can we keep him?" he said. Nora looked at the dog. The dog looked back at her with calm, dark eyes. "He can stay," she said, "as long as he earns his place." He earned it the very next morning, when he lifted his head and growled low in his throat a full 2 minutes before a truck appeared at the end of the drive. Nora was inside, tools in hand, nowhere near finished. 2 minutes. Just enough time to close things up and walk out to meet whoever was coming with her expression carefully arranged. She would need those 2 minutes again before long, because Wyatt Greer was already watching, and the storm, the one that would change everything, was already gathering itself somewhere out beyond the ridge, patient and enormous, waiting for its moment. And beneath the floorboards, in the dark, her father's notebook lay waiting too. The first wall of insulation went up on a Tuesday. Nora had read the instructions so many times she no longer needed them. She knew the order of things by feel now. The sequence of panels, the placement of seams, the way the curved steel wanted to be worked with rather than against. Her father had written something about that in the notebook, though she hadn't read far enough yet to find it. She kept the notebook close. She wasn't ready to open it all the way. Not yet. Eli sat on an overturned crate near the barn wall, doing his schoolwork by the light of a battery lantern. He had a composition book and a pencil, and a seriousness about his studies that had only deepened since they left the city. He asked for help with his arithmetic sometimes, and Nora would stop what she was doing and come sit beside him, their heads close together in the lamplight, and for a few minutes the weight of everything would lift slightly. Scout lay between them, facing the barn door. Always facing the barn door. The work was slow. Her hands were not accustomed to this kind of labor. The gripping, the lifting, the repeated motion that left her forearms aching by mid-afternoon. An accountant. That had been her world. 15 years at a desk had been her world. Managing numbers with the precision of someone who understood that small errors compound into catastrophic ones. She brought that same precision here. Every measurement checked twice. Every bolt torqued to specification. Every seam sealed before moving to the next. What she was building was not just a shelter. It was an argument. A legal one. By the time that hearing arrived, she intended to be standing inside a home, warm, solid, and undeniably fit for a child. And she intended to have built every inch of it herself. She just had to do it without anyone finding out. Nora had grown up watching her father work. That was the thing she had not fully understood until she found herself doing the same things. The measuring, the checking, the refusal to move forward until the current thing was right. For a long time, she had assumed she had grown up to be nothing like him. Accounting had been her path. Numbers, clean abstraction, into the clean abstraction of figures that behaved according to rules. The man she married moved through the world with the confidence of someone who expected it to accommodate him. City life, professional clothes, glass buildings, and attended meetings in glass buildings where the weather was something that happened to other people outside. And yet, here she was, in a barn, with her father's notebook and her father's methods, and her father's refusal to stop just because things were difficult. She was not surprised, but she was moved by it, by the way things that seem lost in a person can simply be waiting, dormant, for the conditions that will call them back. Eli had those things in him too. She could see it already, the way he watched her hands when she worked, the way he asked questions that went one level deeper than the surface of things, the way he had taken Scout's arrival as a practical matter to be addressed practically. Not a source of excitement, but a responsibility to be accepted or declined on its actual merits. Her father would have liked him enormously. She held that thought sometimes in the evenings when the work was done and Eli was reading and Scout was breathing heavily beside the stove. She held it like a coin found in a coat pocket. Unexpected, small, and worth more than its size suggested. The town had opinions. Towns like that always do. The general store was where most of them were exchanged. A low-ceilinged place with wood floors and shelves that went back farther than they appeared to from outside, run by a man named Grover Finch, who listened to everything and said very little. He was not unkind, but he was a record keeper by nature, and what he recorded, in his memory if not on paper, was the shape of things. Who was prospering? Who was struggling? Who had arrived from somewhere else and failed to understand how things worked? Nora was firmly in the third category, as far as Grover was concerned. Marvel Doss held court at the counter most mornings, a coffee cup in hand, speaking at a volume she had long since stopped calibrating to her audience. She had a gift for observation and a talent for interpretation, and these two things did not always produce accurate results. "She was out there again last night," Marvel said one morning, not for the first time. "Lights in that barn, past midnight." "Maybe she can't sleep," Grover offered. "Nobody goes into a condemned barn at midnight because they can't sleep, Grover." Marvel set down her cup. "There's something going on out there. I've said it from the beginning." Wyatt Greer said nothing. He was standing at the far end of the counter, looking at his coffee, but his jaw had the tightness of a man storing something up. Patience he intended to spend carefully when the moment was right. The morning Sheriff Boone Calloway drove out with Wyatt beside him. Scout heard them first. The dog lifted his head from the barn floor, ears forward, and gave the low, specific growl that Nora had come to understand meant someone was approaching. She put down her tools immediately. She looked at Eli. He was already moving, quick and quiet, the way they had practiced, back into the shadow of the far wall, behind the first completed curve of steel. She pulled the tarp across the opening. It wasn't perfect, but from the door, it would look like covered equipment. It would look like storage. She was standing in the open space of the barn, brushing sawdust from her coat, when the doors swung back. Calloway came in first. He was a tall man, broad through the shoulders, with the unhurried way of moving that belonged to people who had learned early that rushing rarely improved anything. He took in the barn slowly, moving from wall to wall. His gaze had the quality, not darting, not suspicious, just taking inventory. Wyatt Greer came in behind him. His attention moved differently, hunting rather than surveying. "Miss Hale," Calloway said, with a nod that was neither warm nor cold. "Just doing a routine check. We've had some concerns raised about the structural integrity of the building, for safety purposes." "I appreciate that," Nora said. Her voice was level. Under her coat, her heart was doing something complicated. "The barn is storage only. I don't spend time in here." Calloway considered her for a moment. His gaze moved to the tarp, then back to her. A particular stillness settled across his face, not suspicion exactly, more like the look of a man doing quiet arithmetic. "Looks like you've got some equipment in here," he said. "Farm equipment," she said. "Came with the property." The silence lasted 4 seconds. She counted. "Right," Calloway said finally. "Well, as long as you're not sleeping in here, we don't have an issue. Buildings condemned for habitation. Storage is fine." He turned toward the door. "Wyatt." Wyatt Greer did not move immediately. He was still looking at the tarp, at the particular shape of what was underneath it. His eyes had narrowed to the expression of a man who knows he is being told half a story. "Wyatt," Calloway said again, and this time it had a different quality. Wyatt turned and walked out. Nora didn't let herself breathe until she heard the truck doors close. She stood in the quiet of the barn for a long moment. Then she walked back to where Eli was crouched behind the steel frame, Scout pressed against his side. "They're gone," she said. Eli looked up at her. "Did they see?" "No." He nodded slowly. Then, "Mama, if they find out, will they take me?" She crouched down in front of him. She looked at his face, so careful, so watchful, so much older than 9 had any right to be. "Listen to me," she said. "I am going to finish what I started. When I am done, no one will question where you live. You understand?" He held her gaze for a moment. Then he nodded again, in the way he had. Grave, considered, as if he was filing the information somewhere important. That night, after he was asleep, Nora sat alone in the unfinished shell of the Quonset hut and opened her father's notebook to the first page. The handwriting was exactly as she remembered it. Small and precise, slightly slanted. The hand of a man who measured twice and cut once, who believed that getting things right mattered more than getting them done fast. She read 3 pages. Then she closed it, because what she had read required sitting with. She would open it again when she was ready for the rest. Old Clem Aldrich arrived on a Thursday afternoon with no warning and no explanation. He was 78 years old, short and weathered, with the hands of a man who had spent his life in conversation with difficult materials. He walked into the barn without knocking. There was no door to knock on, precisely, and stood looking at what Nora had assembled so far with the expression of someone evaluating work they had strong opinions about. "You've got the anchor bolts wrong," he said. Nora turned from where she was working. "Excuse me?" "The anchor bolts on the eastern end." He pointed. "Way you've got them, you'll get flex in a high lateral load. Wind comes in from the north, and it will. That end is going to move. Not collapse, but move." He paused. "You don't want movement." Nora looked at the bolts. She looked at her father's notebook, open on the crate beside her. "My father wrote it differently," she said. "Your father was a careful man," Clem said. "He'd have caught it on revision. He didn't get to revision." He said this without sentiment, as a fact. Then he looked at her directly. "You're Thomas Hale's girl." The name landed differently than she expected. She hadn't heard anyone say it out loud in a long time. "Yes," she said. Clem nodded once. "I knew him, worked alongside him some years back when he was building on this land the first time." He paused. "I watched them make him take it down. Wyatt Greer's father started it and Wyatt finished it. Your father never recovered from that, financially or otherwise." Nora was quiet for a moment. "How long have you known I was here?" she asked. "Since the first truck arrived." Clem walked over to the eastern anchor bolts and crouched down with the ease of a man who has maintained his joints through decades of use. "Hand me that wrench." She handed it to him. "Why didn't you say anything?" she said. He looked up at her. "Because you were doing it right. Mostly." He turned back to the bolt. "Your father would have been glad to know you came back." He adjusted 3 bolts and left without another word, refusing the coffee she offered. She watched him go, and then stood looking at the eastern end of the structure. At the bolts he had corrected unrequested, unexplained, as if the correction were simply obvious. She had not told him about the envelope tucked inside the notebook's back cover. She had not mentioned it at all. And yet, as he walked toward the barn door, he had passed directly over the loose floorboard where she had found it, without looking down, without hesitating, as if he already knew what lay beneath it, and had known for a very long time. She set down her wrench slowly. The story she thought she was living, she was beginning to understand, was larger than she had realized. The work continued. Days had a structure now, which helped. Mornings, Eli's lessons. She taught him at the table inside the Quonset hut's growing interior with the same rigor she applied to everything else. He was a good student, thorough, unhurried, occasionally brilliant in the sideways manner of children who think carefully before they speak. Afternoons. Construction. The insulation panels went in steadily. The subfloor came next. Plywood over a vapor barrier, level despite the uneven ground, fitted together with the patience of a puzzle. She built shelving from salvaged timber. She hung a small mirror on the curved interior wall, and the first time she saw her own reflection in it, standing inside the structure with a lantern behind her, she barely recognized herself. Thinner, stronger. A new steadiness had settled in her expression that hadn't been there before. Late afternoons, Scout's walk. Eli took him out along the fence line while there was still light, and she would watch them from the barn doorway. The boy and the dog moving through the brown winter grass. Scout's pale coat bright against the dead field. Eli's scarf trailing behind him. These were the minutes when she allowed herself to feel something other than determined. Evenings, the notebook. She was reading it slowly, in the order her father had written it, which was not always chronological. He had been a man who circled back, who added notes in margins, who returned to earlier pages with new information. Reading it was like a conversation with someone who had thought carefully about things she had never known to ask him. He had written about the building techniques, yes, but he had written about other things too. About the land. About what he had discovered when he first broke ground. About a series of documents he had placed somewhere safe, for someone who might come looking. She found the relevant passage on a Wednesday evening, while Eli slept and Scout breathed steadily beside the small stove. "The envelope is behind the back cover," her father had written. "But do not open it until you understand what Wyatt Greer took from us. The documents inside are evidence. Do not use them lightly. Use them only when you need to win." She kept reading. 3 pages later, she found the passage she had not noticed before. "The door should open wider when the storm is bigger." He had written it without context, without explanation. The way he wrote things he considered self-evident, as if the meaning needed no elaboration for anyone paying attention. She put the notebook down. She sat with that for a long time. Then she got up and checked that the barn door was secured, and went to where she had stored the envelope and held it in her hands without opening it. Not yet. Her father had been specific. She needed to understand first. She was beginning to, but she wasn't there yet. The notice arrived on a Friday. It was slipped under the trailer door. A formal document citing the condemned status of the barn and requiring all materials stored therein to be removed within 30 days, pending demolition assessment. Signed by the county building authority. CC'd to Wyatt Greer as the filing party. Nora read it twice. Then she folded it carefully and set it on the table and made herself a cup of tea and drank it standing at the window, watching the light change over the fields. 30 days, she calculated quickly. The hearing was in 6 weeks. If the assessment moved fast, and Wyatt would push it fast, there was a real possibility that someone official would be inside that barn before the hearing date. And if they were inside that barn, they would find the Quonset hut. And if they found the Quonset hut, her husband's lawyers would have the ammunition they needed. The same week, a letter arrived from her own lawyer's office, brief and formal. He was withdrawing from her case. He cited scheduling conflicts, which she knew was not the true reason. The true reason was the kind of pressure that doesn't need to announce itself. She was alone. No legal representation. A demolition notice. A hearing in 6 weeks. A 9-year-old boy asleep in the next room who did not know how close the edges were getting. That night was the hardest one. She sat inside the finished half of the Quonset hut, warm, solid, the stove ticking quietly, her father's notebook in her lap. And she thought about calling her husband's lawyers directly. She thought about the deal they had offered 6 months ago, the one she had refused: joint custody, generous visitation, Eli living primarily with his father in the city, with a room that had good light and bookshelves and no frozen ground outside the window. She thought about how much easier that would be. Her hand was on her phone. The barn door shifted. Not much. Just the way a door does when something leans against it from the inside. Scout had woken up. He was sitting upright, watching her. Then Eli appeared in the doorway between the finished and unfinished sections of the hut, in his pajamas, hair disordered from sleep, blinking in the low light. He looked at her. He looked at the phone in her hand. He looked at the notebook in her lap. He came and sat beside her. He didn't say anything. He just reached over and placed his hand on the notebook's cover, on top of his grandfather's handwriting. Then he looked at her and said very quietly, "Grandpa's book. You haven't finished reading it." She stared at him. He got up, went back to his section of the hut, and was asleep again within minutes. Nora put the phone down. She opened the notebook and read until morning. By the time she had finished reading, she understood what her father had found. She understood why the land had mattered so much to him, and what Wyatt Greer had done to take it, and why the documents in the envelope needed to be handled with care. She also understood something else, something her father had written near the end of the notebook, in a passage more personal than the rest, more tired, more honest. The mistake I made was waiting until I had no choices left. By then, the only moves available to me were desperate ones. Do not wait that long. Find your allies before you need them. The land rewards patience, but the law does not. She read it 3 times. Then she set down the notebook, put on her coat, and went out into the early morning to look at the structure she had built. The old barn creaked around it in the cold, but inside the steel frame, the temperature held. Every morning for 3 weeks, she had checked it. It never dropped below the point that mattered, even on the coldest nights. The design was precise. Her father had understood the principles of how heat moves, stays, and can be held, and he had written all of it down. And now she knew it too. She was not out of options. She was not there yet. She needed a lawyer. She needed to find an ally before she needed one. And somewhere behind the ridge to the north, though no one in the valley was paying attention, the sky was beginning to change color in a way that the animals noticed before the people did. Scout had been pacing for 2 days. Nora had read about barometric pressure in her father's notebook, not as meteorology, but as practical knowledge, the kind a person develops when their life depends on reading what the natural world is telling them. The pressure was dropping. She didn't know yet what that meant for the valley, or for the people in it, or for the 30 days ticking down on the county notice pinned to her trailer wall. But she filed it, the way her father had taught her, in the back of the mind, where the important observations go, where they wait until the moment arrives to be useful. She went back inside and started breakfast. There was still work to do. There was always still work to do. And somewhere across the valley, Wyatt Greer was already on his 2nd cup of coffee, already making calls, already certain, as he had been from the beginning, that the woman in the barn would fold before he had to. He had been wrong about her from the first day. He just didn't know it yet. What would you have done in her place? With the notice on the wall and the hearing 6 weeks out and the phone in your hand and your child asleep in the next room. Would you have stayed, or would you have made the call? The letter from her lawyer was only 4 sentences long. Nora read it standing at the trailer door in the early morning cold, still in her coat from the walk to the mailbox. 4 sentences. Scheduling conflicts. Deeply sorry. Wishes her well. She folded it along its original crease. She stood a moment, looking at the field. The dead grass moved in the wind. Scout sat beside her boots and watched her face the way dogs do when they understand something has shifted. She put the letter in her coat pocket and went inside to make Eli's breakfast. She did not tell him. He was 9 years old. He deserved mornings that started with oatmeal and not with the particular silence of a woman recalculating everything. She made the oatmeal. She put brown sugar on top because he liked it. She watched him eat and listened to him describe a dream involving Scout and a river and a very large fish that turned out, on closer inspection, to be a log. She laughed in the right places. She poured herself coffee, and beneath the surface of all of it, her mind was moving fast and quiet, the way it had always moved when the numbers stopped adding up, and she needed to find another way through. No lawyer, demolition notice, hearing in 6 weeks, no legal representation, and no obvious path to finding any. Her father had written, "Find your allies before you need them." She was already past that point, but she was not yet out of time. Marvel Doss had escalated. What had begun as passive observation, the slow drives past the property, the coffee counter reports, had become something more deliberate. Marvel had begun talking to people Nora had not yet met. The woman who ran the church auxiliary, the man who sat on the county planning committee, the retired school teacher who had, until recently, been leaving small packages of food on the trailer step without knocking, a kindness that had stopped abruptly the previous week. Nora noticed its absence. The small brown bags, bread, sometimes a jar of something preserved, once a pair of wool socks for Eli, had simply stopped coming. She had never seen who left them. She had intended to find out and say thank you. Now the opportunity had closed without explanation, and she understood, without being told, that Marvel had gotten there first. The town was a small system. Pressure applied in the right places moved through it quickly. Wyatt Greer understood this. He had spent his career understanding it. Nora was learning it. The hard way, which was the only way it could be learned from the outside. She thought about what it meant to be known in a place. In the city, she had been relatively anonymous. One professional among many, legible to others only through the version of herself she chose to present. In a town this size, there was no such option. The shape of what you were preceded you into every room. People had already formed their opinions before you arrived, and revising those opinions required something beyond ordinary effort. She had spent months being known in the wrong way. The woman who had come from somewhere else and failed to understand how things worked. The woman with no visible plan and a condemned barn, and a child who didn't speak. The woman Wyatt Greer had decided to make an example of, and who Marvel Doss had decided to make a story about. She was beginning to understand that the only way to be known differently in a place like this was not to argue with the existing story, but to simply keep doing things until the evidence accumulated and the story had to change. Her father had understood this. He had written about it in the notebook, not as a piece of advice, but as an observation. As careful men record what they have noticed. People believe what they see over a long period, he had written, more than they believe what they are told in a short one. Show them. Keep showing them. Eventually, the showing becomes the thing they know. She was showing them every morning, every repair, every lesson she gave Eli at the small table, every time she walked through town with her head level and her expression composed. She was showing them who she actually was, which was different from the woman they had decided she must be. It was slow. It was also the only way. Calloway came alone on a Tuesday afternoon. He was not in his official vehicle. He drove a plain dark truck that she didn't recognize until he got out, and she saw his face. He was not in uniform. He wore a heavy work coat and a hat pulled low, and he walked toward her with his hands in his pockets and the expression of a man who has decided to say a thing he has been holding back for some time. "Miss Hale," he said. "Sheriff." "Boone," he said. "When I'm not in the uniform, it's Boone." She waited. He studied the barn for a moment. Then his attention settled on her. "I know about the Quonset structure," he said. She kept her face still. "I've known for a while," he said. "I'm not here to do anything about it. I want to be clear about that up front." He paused. "I'm here because there's something you need to know, and I've been deciding for 2 weeks whether it was my place to tell you. I've decided it is." Nora crossed her arms against the cold. "Go ahead." He looked at the ground for a moment, then back at her. "Wyatt Greer has done this before," he said. "Not exactly this, not the same situation, but the same shape of thing. A family came into this valley some years back, built something on land they'd bought fair and square. Wyatt decided he wanted that land. He used the county systems, permits, assessments, code violations, to make their situation impossible. Lawyer pressure, community pressure, the kind of thing that doesn't leave fingerprints." Nora was quiet. She had suspected some version of this. Hearing it spoken out loud was different. "That family left in the winter," Calloway continued. "They didn't have anywhere to go. They packed what they had and drove out in the cold." He stopped. He seemed to be choosing the next words carefully. "The youngest child, a boy, 3 years old, didn't survive the journey. Exposure. They'd been living in their vehicle for 2 weeks before they could reach family. The field was very quiet. That child," Nora said slowly, "was he my sister's son?" Calloway said it without drama, as a fact. "I was the sheriff who looked the other way when it was happening. I told myself there was nothing I could do within the law. I told myself I wasn't sure enough." He met her eyes directly. "I was sure enough. I just didn't want the trouble." A long moment passed between them. "I will not do that again," he said. "I can't stop what Wyatt is doing through official channels. Not yet. But I found you a lawyer. Someone who doesn't owe Wyatt anything. Because she's not from here, and she's not trying to build anything here. She does property and family law. She's seen the demolition notice. She wants to talk to you." He held out a folded piece of paper. "A name. A number. Nothing else." Nora took it. "Why are you doing this?" she said. Calloway was quiet for a moment. "Because your father built something on this land," he said. "I was a boy when they made him tear it down. I watched it happen from the road." He turned back toward his truck. "I thought it was wrong then, too." He drove away without another word. Nora stood holding the piece of paper, Scout pressed against her leg. Above the ridge to the north, the sky was a shade of pale that she had noticed before, but not yet named. She went inside and called the number. What Nora didn't tell Eli, what she hadn't told anyone, was that the night Calloway had come to warn her was also the night something shifted in the way she understood why she was here. She had come to this land because it was what she could afford, because it was the only answer available to her at the moment she needed an answer. When she signed the papers, she told herself that it was a practical decision and nothing more. She was not a sentimental person. She did not believe in signs or destiny or the particular comfort of certain narratives about how things are meant to happen. But standing in the barn that night after Calloway left, holding the piece of paper with Vera Whitstone's name on it, she had felt a feeling she could not precisely name. A kind of alignment, the sense of a current that had been pulling in one direction for a long time, longer than she had known to pay attention, and was only now becoming visible as a force because she was finally positioned at the right angle to see it. Her father had built here, had been driven away, had left a notebook and an envelope and a set of instructions that amounted to a message across time. I was here. I built something. I was not able to keep it, but I left what you would need. She had come back, not because she knew any of this. She had not known it when she signed the papers. She had come back because the land was available, and she was desperate, and it was what she could afford. And yet, here she was, standing where her father had stood, holding what he had prepared for her to hold. She was not a sentimental person, but she stood in the barn for a long time that night, in the cold gap between the outer wooden shell and the warm steel interior, and she thought about the particular way that love persists across time, not through feeling, which fades, but through preparation, which endures. Through the things a person does when they understand they will not be there, but someone they love might be. Her father had prepared for her. He had not known he was doing it, but he had done it. She went back inside and added another log to the stove and stood beside it until her hands were warm. The lawyer's name was Vera Whitstone, and she had a voice like someone who had stopped being surprised by human behavior a long time ago and had found, on the other side of that surprise, a very clear and functional calm. They spoke for an hour. Nora explained everything: the structure, the timeline, the hearing, the demolition notice, her former lawyer's withdrawal. She did not mention the envelope yet. She was still following her father's instruction. Understand before you use it. Vera listened without interrupting. At the end, she said, "The demolition notice is on shaky ground. The filing is technically proper, but the speed is unusual. That's a pressure tactic, not a legitimate safety concern, and a judge with a working brain will see that. What concerns me more is the custody angle." She paused. "Is the structure genuinely habitable? Warm, structurally sound, appropriate for a child?" "Yes," Nora said. "Can you document that?" "I can." "Then that's what we build the case around," Vera said. "The structure isn't the problem, it's the solution. We just have to make sure the court sees it that way before Wyatt's pressure changes the framing." Nora felt something loosen in her chest that had been tight for weeks. "There's something else," she said. "Documents. Evidence of what Wyatt did to a previous landowner. I haven't opened the envelope yet." A pause. "Where did you get these documents?" "My father left them." A longer pause. "Don't open the envelope without me present," Vera said. "When can I come to you?" They made an arrangement. 3 days from now. She hung up and sat for a moment in the quiet of the hut. And for the first time in a long time, she felt not confident. She was too careful for confidence. But possible. Like the shape of a future she could actually reach was beginning to clarify through the fog. She did not know yet what was coming. None of them did. But Scout was pacing again. And when she checked her father's notebook that evening, the section he had written about reading the natural world, about the small signals that preceded large events, she found herself reading it with a new attention. The barometer she'd rigged from her father's instructions had dropped another 2 points since morning. She went to the town meeting on a Thursday evening. She had not planned to. She had enough to manage without walking into a room full of people who had collectively decided she was a problem. But Vera had said on the phone that it would be useful to have a record of her participation in the community, that it demonstrated stability, rootedness, the kind of ordinary civic engagement that courts found reassuring. So she went. She sat near the back with her coat on. Eli was home with Scout, strict instructions not to open the barn door for anyone. She had been to enough of these to know the shape of them. Old business, new business, the slow procedural dance of a small community managing its own affairs. She waited until the floor opened, and then she stood. She had her father's notebook. She had the barometric readings. She had, carefully translated into plain language, what the combination of those readings and the sky's behavior over the past several days suggested about what was coming. She kept it simple. She did not use technical language. She said that she had been studying the pattern since she arrived, using methods her father had recorded over many years, and that what she was seeing indicated a significant weather event, not a regular winter storm, but something larger and faster, moving in a way that gave less warning than people expected. She said that people who lived outside of town, alone or in poorly insulated structures, should make arrangements in advance. She was not a meteorologist. She was a woman reading her father's instruments, and those instruments had never been wrong about this particular combination of signals. The room listened with the quality of listening that is mostly waiting for the speaker to finish. Wyatt Greer spoke before anyone else. He didn't raise his voice. He never needed to. He spoke with the easy authority of a man who had spent enough years shaping this community to feel entitled to define the terms of every conversation held within it. "Miss Hale came to us from the city," he said pleasantly. "She's been here one season. She's reading from a notebook." He smiled. "I've been through 40 winters in this valley. I think we can trust our own experience." A few people nodded. A few people looked at their hands. Old Clem Aldrich stood up from the second row. He was not a man who spoke often at these meetings. When he did, people tended to listen, not out of affection, but out of the respect that accumulates over decades of simply being right about things. "I've seen this sky before," he said. "She's right. God help you if you don't prepare." He sat back down. The room shifted slightly, not enough, not the way it needed to shift. The meeting moved on. New business, a drainage issue on the county road, a proposal for a new flagpole outside the library. Nora gathered her notebook and left. She drove back to the farm in the dark, and when she came around the bend in the road and saw the faint, warm glow beneath the barn door, she felt, as she always did, a complicated and private pride. She had built that, with her own hands, in the dark. From her father's knowledge and her own stubbornness, she had built something that held warmth against the cold. She parked and went inside, and Eli was asleep with Scout across his feet. She checked the barometer. It had dropped another 1.5 since she left. She stood looking at it for a long time. Then she went around the interior of the Quonset hut with the systematic attention of a woman running final checks. Wood supply, food stores, water, the medical kit she had assembled from notes in her father's notebook, not for illness, but for cold, for the specific ways cold moves through a body and what is needed to bring warmth back without causing harm. The stores would last herself and Eli 3 weeks. She stood in the center of the finished hut and looked at the curved steel walls her father had designed and she had built. And she thought about something he had written in the final pages of the notebook. Not instructions, not technical data, but something simpler. A shelter is not for you alone. A shelter built only for yourself is just a hiding place. The value of what you build is tested by how many it can hold. She had read that passage and felt a pull of unease move through her. She knew what he meant. She also knew that the people most likely to need her shelter were the same people who had, for months, made her life considerably harder. She had not yet decided how she felt about that. She was about to find out. The storm arrived the following night. It did not arrive the way storms are supposed to, with a long gray approach, a gradual darkening, hours of warning. It came in the way her father had described in his notebook, moving on a pressure differential so steep it functioned almost like a wall. 1 hour the sky was pale and still. The next, the wind had found a voice that didn't sound like wind at all. It sounded like something structural failing, like the sound the world makes when it is being rearranged without consent. The temperature dropped so fast that Nora's thermometer, mounted on the exterior of the barn wall, moved from cold to dangerous in the time it took her to read it twice. Cold that doesn't negotiate. Cold that finds every gap, every failure of insulation, every place where the design was not quite good enough, and moves in. She brought Eli inside the Quonset hut and bolted the inner door. "Is it bad?" he asked. "It's a big one," she said. He looked at Scout. Scout was lying down, completely still, not pacing anymore, because the thing he had been warning about had arrived, and there was nothing left to warn about. "Okay," Eli said in the way he had, and went to sit with the dog. Outside, the old barn groaned. She had calculated for this. The way the exterior wooden structure would take the lateral force of the wind. The way the steel inside would hold regardless. Her father had understood it. She had built it right. The Quonset hut did not move. Inside, the temperature held at 70 degrees. She sat in the warmth and listened to the world outside coming apart. And she thought about the town, about the houses she had driven past every time she went for supplies. The older ones that had always looked insufficient to her. The ones on the open ground north of the main road that had nothing between them and whatever came in from the ridge. She thought about Marvel Doss, who lived in one of those houses. She thought about the people who had sat in that meeting room and nodded along when Wyatt Greer smiled. She was still thinking about them when she heard the first knock. It was not a loud knock. The wind was loud. The knock was barely audible through the barn door. Tentative, almost uncertain. The knock of someone who isn't sure they have the right to ask for what they're asking for. She looked at Eli. He looked back at her. She pulled on her coat and opened the inner door and crossed the cold gap of the barn's outer shell and put her hand on the barn door latch. She thought briefly about what her father had written. The value of what you build is tested by how many it can hold. And something else, something she had found 3 pages later, written without context, as if it were obvious. The door should open wider when the storm is bigger. She opened the door. Calloway was there. He had Marvel Doss by the arm. She was gray-lipped, barely standing, her coat glazed with ice. Behind them, the world was white and screaming. "Her car went into the ditch," Calloway said. His voice was rough with cold. "My vehicle's dead. We couldn't make it back to town." Nora looked at Marvell. Marvell looked at her. It was not a long look, but something passed through it. Recognition, and something on Marvell's side that might have been the beginning of shame. "Come in," Nora said. "Get warm." She stepped back and held the door wide. They were not the last ones. 20 minutes later, a family of 4 appeared out of the white. A man carrying a child on each side, his wife just behind him. None of them dressed for what was happening outside. Their roof, had gone. They had walked with no destination, just away from the sound of it giving way. Nora opened the door wider. A young man came alone after that. One of the ones she had seen outside the general store. One of the ones who had made a comment she had chosen not to hear more than once. He stood at the door with the specific stillness of someone who doesn't know if they deserve to be there. "Come in," she said, same words, same tone. "Get warm." He came in. Others followed. Not all at once, in small groups, in pairs, alone. Each arrival preceded by a knock that had the same uncertain quality, the knock of people arriving at a door they had no reason to expect would open. She opened it every time. 17 people by the end. 17 people in a space built for two. Warm, sealed against the storm, the stove burning steadily, the temperature holding. The old barn shuddered around them. The steel inside did not move. Eli appeared from the interior of the hut and stood looking at the people filling the space. Then he went to the wooden crate he used as a seat during lessons, pulled it to the center of the floor, and climbed up on it. "You can sit down," he said to the room. "There's room if we move the crates to the wall, and there's soup. It's not a lot, but it's hot." Nora looked at her son standing on that crate, 9 years old, directing the rearrangement of her shelter with the calm authority of someone who had watched his mother build something from nothing and understood, at a cellular level, that this was what you did with a sturdy thing. You shared it. She turned back to the barn door and checked the latch. Outside, the storm was at its worst. The temperature was still falling. And on the other side of the valley, in the house on the hill, Wyatt Greer's roof was making sounds that no roof should make. 17 people. 17 people who had laughed at her, reported her, tried to take her son. And she opened the door for every single one of them. What would you have done? Asked for. Inside the storm. 17 people take up more space than you expect. Not just physically, though that too. The particular warmth of many bodies in an enclosed space. The way the air thickens and softens. The way you stop being able to move from one end to the other without stepping around someone. But the other kind of space. The kind made of sound and breath and the small involuntary noises people make when they have just come in from something terrible and are beginning, slowly, to believe they might be all right. Nora had built the Quonset hut for 2 people and a dog. What she had was 17 people, 1 dog, and the remains of 3 days of food stores that she was already calculating in her head, dividing by head count, figuring margins. She did not do this visibly. She moved through the space with the steady efficiency of someone who has a plan, even when the plan is still being formed, which is sometimes the same thing as actually having one. The children went nearest the stove. That was the first decision. There were 4 of them. The 2 the father had carried in. A boy of perhaps 7 and a girl younger than that, plus a quiet child who had arrived with an older couple and had not spoken since she came through the door. And Eli, who had appointed himself half host and a junior foreman and was currently helping rearrange supply crates along the east wall to open up sleeping space. The adults sorted themselves with the instinctive social geometry of people who have been shocked into setting their hierarchies aside, at least temporarily. The young man who had come alone sat near the door, not quite integrated. The family of 4 had pulled together into their own small unit. Calloway had positioned himself near the barn's inner entrance. Still, Nora noticed, oriented toward the exits, toward the possibility of need. Marvell Doss sat closest to the stove, wrapped in the blanket Nora had given her first, and she had not said a word since she came in. She sat with the stillness of a woman who has had something very large and very cold pressed up against her understanding of how the world works and is still processing what that means. Nora heated the soup. It was bone broth, mostly. She had made it 2 days before from what she had, slow and long on the small stove, until it was dense and dark and smelled like something fundamental. She had 6 quarts of it. Divided among 17 people, it was not a meal. It was warmth in a cup, which was what was actually needed. She ladled it out without commentary. She handed each person a cup and moved to the next. When she reached Marvel, she paused for just a moment, not long enough to require anything from either of them, and held out the cup. Marvell took it with both hands. She looked up. "Thank you," she said. Her voice was not quite steady. Nora nodded once and moved on. The night had a particular quality she would remember for a long time. Outside, the storm was doing things to the world that they could hear but not see. The sounds of structures under stress, of the old barn's timber frame taking the full weight of the wind and redistributing it, of the valley being rearranged by a force that had not consulted anyone before arriving. Inside, the storm was a sound, a presence, something they were collectively on the other side of. The stove burned steadily. The steel walls held. The temperature on the interior thermometer stayed fixed in its position. Warm, improbable, exact. Nora moved through the space doing what needed doing. She checked on the children first, then the older couple, then the man who had come in with frost on his eyebrows and hadn't fully stopped shaking for the first hour. She knew, from her father's notebook, exactly how cold moves through the body and how warmth must be returned. Gradually, not fast, starting at the core and working outward, never applying heat too quickly. Never the instinct moves that feel right but cause damage. She applied this knowledge now with the quiet authority of someone working from real understanding in a real situation, and the people around her felt the difference between that and guessing, even if they couldn't have said exactly what the difference was. Calloway watched her work. He did not offer to help until she asked, which she eventually did. Organizing the sleeping arrangements for the children, moving the heavier crates. He did what she asked without adding to it or redirecting it. She noticed this. It was not nothing. Eli had found a pack of cards somewhere in their supplies and was sitting with the 2 older children, teaching them a game with patient, low-voiced instruction. The boy was learning fast. The girl was less interested in the game than in Scout, who had settled between them with the professional warmth of a dog who understands that this is his current job. The small child, the quiet one who had come with the older couple, had not moved from her position near the stove. She had not spoken. She sat with her knees pulled up, arms around them, eyes open, watching the room with an expression that was not exactly fear and not exactly calm, but something in the space between. The look of a child whose system has absorbed more than it can process and is simply waiting. Scout noticed her at some point during the second hour. He extricated himself from the card game with the unhurried dignity of a dog who knows he is needed somewhere else, walked across the room, and lay down beside her without ceremony. Just settled himself against her side, warm and heavy, and put his head on his paws. The girl did not react immediately. Then, very slowly, she leaned into him. Just slightly. Just enough. Nobody pointed it out. The room went on doing what it was doing. The quiet conversations, the card game, the soup being finished and cups set down. But the room's awareness shifted. People were watching without watching, holding their breath without quite meaning to. 14 minutes passed. Then the girl lifted one hand from around her own knees and placed it on Scout's side. She said very quietly, "Is the dog warm?" The room exhaled. Marvel made a sound that was not quite a word. The mother of the two children pressed her fingers to her mouth. The young man near the door looked at the ceiling. Nora, who was across the room checking the wood supply, heard it. She stayed where she was, facing the wall, for a moment. Then she turned around and continued what she was doing. Eli looked at Scout with an expression of 7 kinds of pride compressed into the face of a 9-year-old boy. "He's always warm," Eli said to the girl. "That's kind of his whole thing." The second night was when people began to talk, not to process or perform or fill silence. Real talking, the kind that happens when ordinary social calculations have been suspended by circumstance. And what remains is just people, in the dark, with nowhere else to be. The older couple talked about a winter from their early marriage. A different storm, a different time. The way they had been snowed into a farmhouse for 4 days with only what they had. The husband had fixed a broken stovepipe with a tin can and determination. The wife had made bread from the last of the flour on the 4th day, and they had eaten it standing at the window watching the snow stop, and neither of them had ever tasted anything better. The father of the two children talked about his own father, who had built their house by hand, how he had always meant to learn more about that, what his father had known about materials, about joinery, about the way a well-built thing behaves differently than one that's just been put up fast and cheap. How he'd never asked before his father was gone. Nora listened to this and said nothing, but she reached over and picked up her father's notebook from where it sat on the shelf above the supply crates, and she held it for a moment, and then she set it back down. The young man near the door, whose name turned out to be Dale, which somehow made him seem more present as a person, had stopped sitting apart by the second evening. He had moved, incrementally, and as if no decision had been made, toward the center of the room. At some point during the night, he had helped Eli reorganize the sleeping arrangements without being asked, and Eli had accepted this assistance with the equanimity of someone who is too practical to turn down useful help regardless of its source. Dale did not say anything to Nora directly, but at one point, when she was moving past him to check on the stove, he said, low and not quite meeting her eyes, "I said something stupid at the general store. A few times. I'm sorry for that." Nora paused. "I know," she said. He nodded. He seemed to understand that this was the full extent of what was available right now, and that it was, under the circumstances, enough. It was late, the deepest part of the second night, when the storm was still present but had changed quality, become less violent and more simply enormous. When Calloway came and sat beside her, everyone else was asleep, or nearly. Eli had fallen asleep against Scout's side, one arm around the dog, face slack and peaceful in the stove light. Marvel was asleep near the stove, still wrapped in the blanket, her face in sleep, looking considerably different than it did awake. Softer, older, more honest somehow. Nora was sitting against the curved interior wall, her father's notebook open in her lap, though she wasn't reading it. She was just holding it. Some things you hold for what they are, rather than what they say. Calloway sat down beside her with the careful distance of a man who is making a point of not assuming anything. He didn't say anything right away. They sat for a while with the sound of the storm and the breathing of sleeping people and the low tick of the cooling stove between them, which was a kind of conversation in itself. "The barometer," he said eventually, quiet. "You built one from the notebook." "He wrote down how," she said. "He wrote down everything. I noticed it when I first came out to the property, before the inspection." A pause. "I noticed a lot of things." She looked at him. "I know," she said. "I know you did." He was quiet for a moment. "Your father was a good man. What happened to him was wrong, and everyone who was in a position to do something about it, including people in my family, didn't." He looked at the stove. "I can't fix that, but I can do what I can do now." Nora looked down at the notebook, at her father's handwriting, at the small, precise letters of a man who had believed, even when things were being taken from him, that the knowledge was worth recording, that someone would come who needed it. "He knew I'd come back," she said, not quite to Calloway, not quite to herself either, just saying it, letting it be real. "He left the notebook," Calloway said. "That's a pretty clear vote of confidence." She almost smiled, not quite, but almost. "The envelope," she said. "Clem's been holding it since my father left. It has documentation, evidence of what Wyatt did." "I know about the documentation," Calloway said. She looked at him. "I've known for a long time," he said. "I couldn't use it without someone who had standing to present it. That's you." He paused. "Vera Whitstone is a good lawyer. I didn't find her by accident." Nora held the notebook. "You've been working on this," she said, "since before you came to tell me?" "Since before the inspection," he said. "Since the first truck arrived at night." He looked at her steadily. "I told you, I'm not looking away this time." They sat without speaking for a little while. The storm outside was losing its sharpest edge. Not gone, still enormous, still present, but the quality of it had shifted in the way that signals to people who know how to listen that the worst has passed. His hand was resting on the floor between them. She looked at it. She looked at her father's handwriting on the open page of the notebook. Then she placed her hand beside his. Not on top. Just beside. He looked at her. She looked at the stove. Neither of them said anything else. Calloway had not said much in those early days. That was the thing she had noticed about him. Not the official silence of a man doing his job, but the considered silence of a man who had learned that speaking too soon was a kind of error. He watched. He assessed. He waited until he had enough information to say something that was actually useful, and then he said it. She respected this. It was not so different from how she approached numbers. The accountant's instinct: don't draw conclusions from incomplete data. Wait for the full picture. What she had not expected was that the full picture, when it finally revealed itself, would include her. Or that he would have been working toward it, quietly, systematically, the way he did everything, for months before she had any idea. She thought about this sometimes, in the way you think about things that are still too new and too large to think about directly. She approached it sideways, through small things. He had answered Eli's questions about the apple tree free of condescension, free of impatience, free of the performance adults often produce when they are trying to demonstrate patience with children. He had just answered, because Eli's questions deserved answers, and he had the answers, and that was the entire transaction. He had cleared her driveway one morning without mentioning it. She had only noticed because the snow was moved in a particular pattern she recognized as deliberate. He had sat beside her in the dark while 17 people slept around them and had said what he meant, cleanly, and nothing more. She was 42 years old. She had been married and had found, at the end of that marriage, that she had never fully been seen in it. That the version of her that had existed in that relationship was a construction, and the collapse of the relationship had felt, among other things, like the relief of no longer having to maintain it. Being seen clearly, she was learning, felt different from what she had expected. It did not feel like exposure. It felt like rest. The morning came the way mornings do after very long nights, not dramatically, but with a gradual and undeniable insistence. Light finding the cracks, the quality of the sound outside changing from the particular chaos of the storm to something slower and more settled. The children woke first. They always do. The small girl, the quiet one, sat up from where she had slept against Scout and looked around the room with the clear eyes of a child who has slept well and woken in a place that turns out, on inspection, to be all right. She looked at Scout. Scout looked back at her. She said, "Good morning, dog." Eli, waking up on Scout's other side, opened one eye and smiled. "His name is Scout," he said. "He likes mornings." She considered this. Then she said to Scout directly, "Good morning, Scout." Scout's tail moved twice on the floor. The older couple were already awake, sitting together quietly. The husband caught Nora's eye across the room and nodded. A single, specific nod, the kind that means something without words. She nodded back. She got up and started the stove again and began heating water, and moved through the space doing the small necessary things that are how a day begins. Around her, people woke gradually, found their bearings, took stock of themselves and each other. Dale was already up, she discovered, because when she opened the barn's exterior door to check conditions outside, she found that someone had cleared a path through the snow that had piled against it overnight. A narrow path, carefully done, just wide enough to pass through. She looked at it for a moment. Then she looked out at the valley. The storm had left the world rearranged. There was more snow than she had words for, and a particular quality of silence that comes after extreme events. Absolute and clean and somehow thoughtful, as if the world is considering what it's done. The sky above the ridge was the pale gray blue of a cold dawn clearing. The trees along the fence line were weighted almost horizontal, and in the distance, on the hill where Wyatt Greer's house sat, she could see, even from here, that the roof line was wrong. She stood looking at it for a moment. She felt no satisfaction. What she felt was closer to something her father had written about. Not with pleasure, but with the honest acknowledgement of a man who had been paying attention to how things work. The storm does not know whose house it takes. It only knows what holds and what doesn't. Build accordingly. She turned and went back inside. Behind her, the path Dale had cleared filled very slightly with blown snow, but held its general shape, a mark in the landscape that said, someone was here. And they did what they could with what they had. 17 people, 17 cups of soup, 3 days of wood and 2 days of food, carefully managed, and a stove that had not gone out. She went back inside to start breakfast with what remained, and thought about what came next, and listened to the sound of people waking up in something she had built with her own hands from her father's knowledge and her own refusal to stop. Outside, the storm was over. Everything else was just beginning. The snow took 2 days to settle into something passable, not cleared. The valley didn't have the equipment for what the storm had left behind, not quickly, but passable, navigable by degrees. First on foot, then by the trucks that came through with chains, then by the gradual return of ordinary movement through a landscape that had been, for a stretch of days, made completely still. Nora spent those 2 days managing the departure of 17 people from a space built for 2. It happened in the order that circumstances allowed. The family of 4 left first. Once the father had walked back to their property and confirmed the house was still standing. Roof intact, pipes frozen but not burst. Damage that could be managed with effort and time. He came back to the barn and shook Nora's hand at the door with a grip that communicated more than he seemed able to say. His wife embraced her quickly and tight, the way people embrace when they mean it thoroughly and are slightly embarrassed by how much. Their children filed out after them, the younger one pausing at the door to look back at Scout with an expression of profound and personal loss. The older couple left mid-morning of the second day. The woman stood in the doorway of the Quonset hut before she left and looked at the interior, at the curved steel walls, the careful shelving built from salvaged timber, the small stove that had burned without interruption through 3 days of the worst weather the valley had seen in memory. She absorbed it the way people absorb things they mean to remember accurately. "Your father would be proud," she said. Nora held the door open. "I hope so," she said. Dale left without ceremony, which suited him and which Nora understood. He had spent the final morning helping Eli stack the remaining wood supply along the interior wall, methodically, unrequested, with the focused quiet of someone making a small and imperfect repair to something they had helped damage. At the door he stopped and looked at Nora with the directness of a person who has decided that looking away is no longer available to him. "If you need anything," he said, "labor, lifting, whatever you need out here." He shifted his weight slightly, uncomfortable with the generosity of his own offer, as if he was still learning to speak that language. "I'm around." "I know where to find you," she said. He nodded once and went. Marvel Doss was last. She had spent the final morning helping quietly, washing the cups, sweeping the floor, folding every borrowed blanket with the corners aligned and the edges straight. Small acts performed without drawing attention to them. They were not large enough to constitute an apology, and she seemed to understand that clearly, which was why she did not present them as one. At the door, she turned around. She was a woman who had spent considerable energy constructing a version of Nora Hale that justified a particular set of behaviors toward her. That version had not survived 3 days inside the structure it had tried to destroy, and Marvel was standing now in the space where it used to be, deciding what could honestly be said. "I told people terrible things about you," she said. "Things I didn't verify. Things I may not have wanted to verify if I'm being truthful about it." She paused. "I'm not asking for forgiveness. I just want you to know that I know what I did." Nora looked at her, at this woman who had driven slowly past the property, who had reported back to Wyatt Greer, who had helped build, piece by patient piece, the pressure that had cost Nora her lawyer and narrowed every option and made the months considerably harder than they needed to be. "My father used to say," Nora said, "that the door should open wider when the storm is bigger. He meant the literal door, but he meant the other thing too." She looked at Marvel steadily. "You came through the door. That counts for something." Marvel pressed her lips together. She nodded once. She left. Nora stood alone in the empty barn after the last footsteps faded down the drive. The space felt large, with only her in it. All that warm air, all that construction done in darkness and cold and silence, built for survival and having survived. She let herself feel the size of it for a moment. Not pride exactly. Something quieter. The feeling of a thing that has been tested and has held. Then she went back inside to find Eli on the floor with Scout, working with patient and largely unsuccessful effort to teach the dog to balance a piece of dried apple on his nose. "She okay?" Eli asked without looking up. "She will be," Nora said. Scout ate the apple off the floor and regarded Eli with dignified satisfaction. Wyatt Greer came on the third day. She had known he would come. She had thought carefully about what form it might take. Official vehicles, additional paperwork, some procedural maneuver she hadn't anticipated. She had spoken with Vera Whitstone the previous evening, the call cutting in and out as the signal towers slowly recovered, and Vera had told her to say nothing, to let him arrive at whatever he had come to arrive at, and to remember that his position was considerably weaker than it had been a week ago. He came alone, on foot. His coat had seen the storm and showed it, stiff at the collar, marked by someone who had been in conditions they were not prepared for. He came up the drive with his hands in his pockets and stopped at a distance from the barn door, slightly too far for ordinary conversation. He looked at the barn for a long time. At the door, at the demolition notice still attached to it, its paper warped and stained by the weather, the official letterhead blurred to something barely recognizable as what it had been. He looked at it the way a person looks at something they produced that has not had its intended effect. Then he turned to Nora, who stood in the doorway with her arms at her sides. She watched him locate and then discard several things he might have said. She recognized the process. She had seen it in negotiations and in the moment when someone powerful reaches the outer edge of what their power extends to and discovers it is shorter than they believed. He said nothing. He closed his mouth. He turned and walked back down the drive. "Then go," Nora said quietly to his back. He did not turn around. He walked to the road and turned onto it and was gone. And she stood in the cold doorway, watching the place where he had been until she was certain he wasn't returning. What she felt was not triumph. She had expected something sharper, some edge of vindication that had been waiting since the first day he had stood at her gate with his calculations. What she felt instead was quieter and more complex. The feeling at the end of a very long calculation when the numbers finally resolve. Not elation, but correctness. The specific relief of something that has been made to add up. She went back inside and made Eli a cup of cocoa from the last of what they had, and they played cards at the small table until the afternoon light faded and the day moved toward its close. The way days do when there is no emergency pressing against them, slowly, without urgency, with the particular quality of an ordinary evening that feels extraordinary precisely because of how long ordinary evenings have been unavailable. The news about Harold Fitch came that same afternoon. Calloway brought it. He had been coming by each day since the storm, initially with firewood and road condition reports, then with decreasing pretense of practicality, as if he was still arriving at the honest acknowledgement that he simply wanted to be there. He sat across from Nora and told her plainly what the deputy had found. Harold Fitch lived alone at the northern edge of the valley, a man so thoroughly absorbed into the landscape that most people had stopped registering him as fully separate from it. He had not come to the town meeting. He had not come to the barn. His heating had failed in the early hours of the storm. He had been alone. Nora sat with the information. "I went to houses before the storm," she said. Houses I knew about. I didn't go to his. You'd been here one season, Calloway said. You couldn't have known every person on every edge of this valley. Someone who had been here longer should have known, she said, and gone to him. A pause. That's the thing about storms. You can be completely right about what's coming and still not be able to save everyone. She said it without bitterness, without the sharpness of someone looking to assign fault. She said it as a fact, the kind of fact her father had written about holding honestly rather than arguing away. She held it carefully, in the part of herself that noticed the things that needed changing. Harold Fitch had existed at the very edge of what the community paid attention to, and the edge was where people fell through. She filed it. It would matter, in ways she could not yet see. Old Clem Aldrich arrived the following morning with Vera Whitstone beside him. Vera had driven through the recovering roads with the attitude of someone for whom road conditions are logistical considerations rather than reasons to delay. She was compact and still, and had the quality of attention that belongs to people who have spent a long time in rooms where what is said and what is true do not always correspond, and have become highly accurate at identifying the gap. They sat at the small table, Nora, Clem, Vera, Calloway, while Eli worked through his lessons at the far end of the hut. Close enough that Nora could see the top of his head bent over his books. Clem placed the envelope on the table, the same envelope he had carried since her father left it in his keeping with specific instructions. Nora picked it up and opened it with the care she gave to things that mattered, and unfolded the contents across the table surface. Her father's handwriting, pages of it, the same hand she had known since childhood, now carrying a weight it hadn't carried then. Dated entries, observations, copies of correspondence made carefully by hand, financial figures, a systematic account, built entry by entry, of what had been done to his property and how it had been done, and by whom. The record of a man who had understood that the truth would only matter eventually if it was recorded with precision. Vera read through it with the unhurried focus of someone doing real work. Her expression maintained its professional stillness, but her quality of stillness shifted partway through, became the stillness of someone who has found what they were hoping to find, and is now assessing what it can do. "This is enough," she said. She said it with the flat precision of a technical assessment. "This is considerably more than enough." She looked at Calloway briefly, then back to the documents. The pattern is unmistakable. What was done to Thomas Hale and what has been done to his daughter are the same action, taken twice, with the same intent and many of the same mechanisms. She aligned the pages with careful fingers. Courts find patterns instructive, particularly when the documentation is this thorough and this specific. "And the custody hearing?" Nora asked. Vera looked at her steadily. "I have Calloway's testimony prepared and documented. Marvel Doss called me 2 days ago, voluntarily, without prompting, and offered to appear. Her exact words were that she had something to correct." A slight pause. "And I have the structure itself as exhibit. 17 people, 3 nights. Safe and at stable temperature throughout conditions that damaged or destroyed most of what this valley had constructed." She tilted her head a degree. "The opposing argument is that you have no stable home to offer your child. Our argument is that you built the most stable home in this valley, from your father's knowledge and your own determination, and then opened it to the people who had been trying to take it from you. I would considerably rather have our argument." Nora looked at the pages spread across the table. at her father's handwriting. He had written all of this, had given it to Clem with instructions, had trusted that someone would come who would know how to use it. He had been waiting for her. In the only way that had been left available to him, she had come back. She was finishing what he had started. The hearing was held on a clear morning when the snow had pulled back from the open ground and the fields were beginning to show, beneath the retreating white, the first tentative color of what was underneath. Nora wore her good coat. She sat beside Vera in the hearing room and listened to the arguments presented against her with the attention of someone who has learned to listen carefully to the internal logic of people who want things that are not fair. The arguments were the same arguments. They had always been the same. Unstable situation, uncertain income, improvised arrangements, a child in conditions unsuitable for long-term habitation. Presented in the right order and the right language, they sounded almost reasonable. They also sounded to Nora like a description of a person she did not recognize. Vera presented the counter as she did everything, without rushing, plainly, in the order most likely to produce understanding in someone paying close attention. The documents first, cross-referenced with county records that confirmed what they described. Then the photographs of the completed Quonset structure, clear, well-lit, taken from angles that showed the interior in its functional entirety. Then the temperature logs Nora had kept every morning in the back pages of her father's notebook, 2 generations of careful observation occupying the same pages. Then Calloway, who gave his account in the flat and specific manner of a person who has decided that simplicity carries more weight than elaboration, and who understands that the most powerful thing available to someone in his position is to simply tell the truth undecorated and let it sit there. Then Marvel, who sat in the chair and said what she had come to say with the directness of someone who has finally decided that the honest version is more useful than the rehearsed one. "I said things about this woman that I cannot take back," Marvel said. "I made her situation harder than it needed to be, deliberately, over a period of months. And then she opened her door in the worst storm this valley has known and kept me alive for 3 days." She looked at the judge without deflecting. "I have never in my life seen a child better cared for than that boy. I am saying that under oath. I would say it anywhere." The judge was a woman in her early 60s with reading glasses she removed and replaced throughout the proceedings, and the quality of sustained attention that belongs to people who have spent a very long time listening to the stories people construct around what they actually want and have become precise at identifying what is underneath. She asked Nora 2 questions directly. The first, "You built this structure yourself?" "With my son's help," Nora said, "and from plans my father left me." The second, "When people who had worked against you came to your door during the storm, what made you open it?" Nora was quiet for a moment, not because she lacked an answer, because she was deciding whether the honest answer could be said plainly in a room like this without sounding like a performance of something rather than the actual thing. She decided it could be said plainly. "My father taught me that a shelter built only for yourself is just a hiding place," she said. "The people who came to my door were cold. That was the only thing that mattered in that moment." She paused. "He also taught me that the door should open wider when the storm is bigger. I was doing what he taught me. I was finishing what he started." The judge looked at her over her glasses for a long moment. She wrote something down, and the hearing moved toward its conclusion. The custody determination arrived 12 days later. Vera called in the early morning, when the light outside was just beginning, and read the relevant language in her professional voice. which maintained its careful composure with only the very faintest additional warmth pressing at its edges, like heat through well-insulated walls. Primary custody, Nora, full and legal and permanent. She sat at the small table after the call ended and held the phone and did not cry, which surprised her. She had expected the moment to arrive with more force, more overwhelm, more release. What moved through her instead was a deep and specific quiet. The feeling of a tension released that has been held so long, you have incorporated it into your sense of what your body feels like. And its absence is disorienting before it is anything else. She sat with it for a moment. Just sat. Then she looked around the interior of the Quonset hut, at the curved steel walls her father had designed and she had built, at the careful shelving, at the stove, at the notebook sitting on the shelf between Eli's school books, and the jar of dried herbs she'd learned, from a later passage in the notebook, to keep through winter. At the small mirror on the curved wall where she had once looked in and barely recognized herself. She recognized herself now. She got up and went to the door and opened it. Eli was in the field with Scout, both of them absorbed in the investigation of the thawing ground, Scout with his nose, Eli with a stick, and the serious focus of a boy who wants to understand what the winter has left behind and what it has uncovered. Eli. He turned. He read her face the way he had learned to read her face. Quickly, invisibly, the practiced accuracy of a child who has spent a careful year paying close attention to his mother's expression because it contained information about what was real. "We won," he said. "We're staying," she said. "This is home. Official. Permanent." He looked at the barn, at the fields, at the structure visible through the open barn door. Curved steel inside weathered timber. Warmth held inside a frame that had looked, from the outside, like something already finished. "Can we plant something?" Eli said. "In the spring. Something that stays." Nora looked at the field, at the pale sky above the ridge, at the land her father had loved and lost, and left her specific instructions to return to. "Yes," she said. "We'll plant something that stays." Calloway came on a Saturday with a young apple tree in the bed of his truck, roots wrapped in burlap, branches still bare and waiting. He set it down near the barn door without ceremony and said the south side would be the right place. Good light, protected from the north wind by the barn itself, the same protection the barn had given the Quonset hut through the worst of winter. He glanced at Nora, then at the tree, then out at the field. Eli came around the corner and stopped. He stood back and regarded the tree with the deliberate seriousness he brought to things he was deciding how to feel about. "Grandpa had apple trees," he said. "At the old place, before everything." He looked at Calloway directly, with a frank evaluation of a child who has decided that his judgment of people matters and should be exercised with care. "He would have liked you. I think he would have." Calloway was quiet for a moment. "I'd have liked to know him," he said. "From what I've learned of him, he was a man worth knowing." They planted the tree that afternoon, all three of them, working in the cold ground that was just beginning to yield at the surface. Eli asked careful questions about depth and drainage and whether apple trees preferred the company of other trees or did better alone. And Calloway answered each one with the patient specificity of a man who has decided this particular boy's questions deserve real answers every time. When the tree was in the ground and the soil tamped down and the whole enterprise inspected from several angles, Eli stood back and looked at it with the expression of someone making a long-range investment. It'll take a few years before it fruits, he said. Most good things do, Calloway said. Eli considered this. Then he went inside to finish his lessons, leaving Nora and Calloway beside the newly planted tree in the late cold light, not quite together and not quite separate, in the way of two people who have arrived somewhere having never formally announced they were traveling anywhere. Thank you, she said, for the tree, for everything that came before the tree. You did the work, he said. I just stopped looking the other way. She looked at the field, at the barn, at the apple tree standing bare and patient in the cold. He would have liked you, she said quietly. Not for Calloway's benefit, just because it was true and deserved to be said out loud. It's worth quite a bit, he said, to hear that. The seasons turned. The demolition notice was formally vacated, rendered moot by a judge who had read the filing and found it wanting. The county record was amended. The documentation her father had left was entered into the formal legal record of what had been done and by whom. Wyatt Greer's name appeared in subsequent proceedings that moved slowly, as such things do, but moved consistently in one direction. Nora was not directly involved in those proceedings. She had given what she had. She let the process continue without her attention because she had enough to attend to. Marvell came on Tuesday afternoons. It began with food she described as surplus and became, over time, simply coming, needing no pretense of a reason, because the reason had resolved itself into a reason that didn't need a cover. She sat at the table and talked with the ease of a woman who has put down something she had been carrying for a long time and finds the world considerably lighter without it. They were not exactly friends. The history between them was too specific for that word to fit cleanly. But they were something. A bond built from wreckage, which gave it a particular durability. Vera sent clients to Nora, women in situations with their own shapes and their own specific difficulties. Nora made time. Legal training was not something she claimed, and she said so directly. She had something different, the knowledge of a person who had been inside the situation and found a way through it, which is a different kind of expertise and sometimes the more useful kind. The workshop began the following summer. It started with one person, a woman who had driven 2 hours after Vera gave her Nora's number, who arrived at the property looking exhausted in a specific way that Nora recognized, and who spent the first hour saying very little and looking at the structure inside the barn with an expression that moved through several stages before settling on something like determination. Nora showed her how the Quonset arches worked, how the insulation created the thermal envelope, how the solar array on the south side of the old barn's roof charged the battery bank that ran the lights, and the small refrigeration unit she'd added the previous autumn. She explained which parts had been hardest and which had been easier than expected. She showed her the notebook, her father's sections and her own additions side by side, and explained how to read the barometric instrument and what to do with the information it provided. The woman came back 3 weeks later with 2 more people. By the end of the warm season, there were workshops on 4 consecutive Saturdays, each one attended by more women than the last. Nora had not advertised. Word had moved through the network that Vera maintained, and through the network Marvel maintained. Somewhat to Nora's amusement, Marvel had become an unexpectedly effective advocate, describing the workshop to anyone who would listen with the evangelical enthusiasm of a convert. She did not charge for the workshops. She charged for materials when people wanted to purchase them through her, and she charged for the plans she drafted when people came with specific properties and specific needs. But the knowledge itself she gave freely, the way her father had given it freely in his notebook. The way knowledge has always moved most effectively when it is treated as knowledge that belongs to everyone rather than a commodity to be owned. The barn was full on those Saturdays in a way it had not been full during the storm, but the feeling was not entirely different. The same warmth, the same specific quality of people learning that they already had most of what they needed and that the rest could be taught. Eli grew. He grew in the way children grow when the conditions are right, quickly and in all directions, intellectually and physically, and in his understanding of what the world required of him and what he could give back to it. He became a person with firm opinions about joinery and bread, and the most effective approach to teaching a dog something the dog has decided it does not want to learn. One afternoon, Nora watched him from the barn doorway. He was outside with the older couple's grandson, showing the younger boy how to read the barometer her father had designed, explaining what each drop in pressure meant and what to watch for in the sky above the ridge. His voice was patient and precise, exactly the way his grandfather's handwriting was patient and precise. And Nora stood in the doorway and felt something move through her that she did not have a word for, but that felt like continuity, like a chain that had seemed broken and had turned out to be only interrupted. She kept his grandfather's notebook on the shelf beside his school books, spine out, referenced often. He added his own notes in the margins over the seasons, questions, corrections, things he had discovered that confirmed or complicated what Thomas Hale had written. Two voices in the same pages, one generation apart. The conversation continuing. The apple tree grew more slowly, which was its nature. In its second spring, it produced blossoms, white and early, appearing before the mornings were reliably warm, ahead of everything else on the property. Eli stood beneath them on the morning they opened and looked up for a long time. He was right, he said. Good things take time. Nora stood beside him and looked at the white flowers against the cold, pale sky. He was right about most things, she said. Scout grew old. It happened across several seasons, slowly enough that no single morning announced it clearly. His muzzle went white first. Then the fur above his eyes. His pace slowed by increments so small that each change was almost invisible, the accumulation only becoming undeniable in retrospect, when you looked back and compared what you remembered to what was in front of you. He remained Eli's dog, completely, without negotiation, in the way that certain animals belong to certain people with a totality that leaves no ambiguity. But he had expanded his sense of responsibility over the years to include a general oversight of the property and everyone who moved through it, conducted from a position of comfortable and dignified authority, usually near the barn door, monitoring arrivals and departures with the professional attention he had brought to the task since the first week he had arrived, thin and watchful, at the edge of the barn, and decided this was where he was supposed to be. He died on a winter morning in the place he had always slept, quietly, peacefully. Eli found him before anyone else was awake, and came and stood in the doorway of the hut with the composure of someone who had been preparing for a thing, and finds, when it arrives, that the preparation helped, but only part way. "Scout's gone," he said. They buried him beside the barn door that afternoon. Eli made the marker himself, working through the cold with tools Calloway had taught him over many Saturdays across many seasons. He worked with precision and took all the time he needed. The marker said what it needed to say, and nothing more than that. He stayed when everyone else left, Nora stood beside the small grave in the cold air and let herself feel the full weight of it. The dog who had appeared from nowhere in the earliest days, gaunt and watchful, arriving at exactly the moment they needed a warning system and a witness and something warm to hold on to. Who had been the bridge between her son and the rest of the world during the season when that bridge was most necessary. Who had lain down beside a silent child in a crowded room during a storm and simply waited, with absolute and uncomplicated patience, for her to find her way back to speaking. She thought of what her father had written near the end of the notebook. You will know you have built something real when what you have built outlasts the immediate necessity. The barn will stand. The knowledge will travel further than you can see. The knowledge had traveled. She watched it travel every season, through the women who came to the table, through the workshop she had begun to teach in the warm months, through Dale who had become reliable, and then skilled, and then someone who taught others, through the family whose children now came to the property on weekend mornings as naturally as if it had always been part of their geography. 17 people had spent 3 nights inside something she had built. Some of them had become part of what came after in ways she had not predicted. The circle of what the barn had held kept expanding, quietly, like warmth radiating from a source that does not stop burning. Eli came home for the first harvest of the apple tree. He had gone away to study engineering, which had not surprised Nora, though the specialty had structural engineering, the behavior of built things under stress, how materials hold and fail and hold again. He had written his qualifying paper on vernacular cold weather construction with a substantial section on a particular case study involving a Quonset hut installed within an existing agricultural structure in a northern valley. The committee had found it unusual. His advisor had found it fascinating. He had graduated with distinction. He came home for the harvest because Calloway had called him. A fact that Nora learned afterward from Eli, who mentioned it the tone of something that seemed obviously fine in retrospect. They picked apples together on a clear October morning, the 3 of them and Eli's daughter, 7 years old, serious, with a habit of pausing before she spoke, that Nora had noticed immediately and had not remarked on, because some things do not need to be remarked on to be understood. The girl was named for her great-grandmother. Nora had not asked for this and had been unable to say anything appropriate when Eli told her, so she had said nothing, and he had understood. They picked apples and put them in the wooden crates Eli had made during one of his winters home, following a design from the notebook. The tree had been generous this year, more fruit than they had expected, more than they could use, which meant bags of apples going to neighbors and to Marvel, and to the families who came to the Saturday workshops. That evening they sat on the bench beside the barn door, Nora and Eli and Calloway and the girl, and ate apple slices with cheese and said very little, because there was not much that needed to be said. The barn door was open. The Quonset hut was visible inside, its steel walls warm in the evening light. Scout's marker stood where Eli had placed it years ago, its carved letters worn soft by seasons, but still legible against the grain of the wood. The girl traced the words with one finger before she read them aloud, the way she had apparently been doing since she learned to read. Not to anyone in particular, just to hear the words become real in the air. Then she looked at Nora and said, "Grandma, will you teach me what great-great-grandpa taught you?" Nora looked at her for a long moment, at this child who was carrying so many things forward without knowing it, who was already asking the right questions. "Yes, my darling," she said. I will teach you everything. Many seasons later, on a clear morning when the apple tree was tall enough to give real summer shade and the fields around the property had the settled look of land that has been well tended for a long time and knows it, Nora sat on the bench beside the barn door. She was older now in the way that people who have worked hard outdoors become older. Her hands showing the work, her face showing the weather, her posture showing nothing of diminishment, but everything of someone who has learned exactly where their weight belongs. The morning was cold and clear. The apple tree's branches were bare in the late season, but held the shape of every spring they had survived. Scout's marker stood beside the door, the letters softened by years, but still fully readable. Her granddaughter came around the corner of the barn with the easy familiarity of a child who has always known this landscape, to whom it is simply the world, unremarkable in its presence, beloved without needing to be named as beloved. She was 7 years old. She had her father's serious eyes and her great-grandfather's habit of pausing before she spoke, as if she was confirming the words before releasing them into the world. She came and stood beside Nora and looked at the apple tree, at Scout's marker, at the barn door, which stood open as it almost always did now. The Quonset hut visible inside, its curved steel walls having taken on, over the years, the particular quality of things that have simply always been there. Were you scared, she said, when you built it, when the storm came? Nora looked at her granddaughter, at the serious eyes, the considered expression, the quality of sustained attention she recognized from Thomas Hale's photographs and from Eli's childhood, and now from this child, carrying it forward without knowing she carried anything at all. Every single night, Nora said. I didn't know if it would hold. I didn't know if I'd done it right. I didn't know if the cold would find the place I'd missed. She paused. Fear doesn't mean you're doing the wrong thing. Sometimes it means you understand exactly what's at stake. The girl thought about this with visible seriousness. But you kept going, she said. I kept going, Nora said, because the work was necessary, and because stopping was not something my father had ever taught me to do. The girl looked at Scout's marker, at the words Eli had carved into it across a long, cold afternoon many seasons ago. He stayed when everyone else left, she read aloud slowly, in the way children read things they want to understand completely. Yes, Nora said. He did. Will you teach me? The girl said. She looked up at Nora. What your father taught you. What you know. All of it. Nora looked at her for a long moment. At this child who had arrived, as all children do, carrying the future in her without knowing it, who would go out into the world with whatever she was given here and make of it whatever she would make, who was already, at 7 years old, asking the right questions. Yes, my darling, Nora said, I will teach you everything. The morning held them both in its cold, clear quiet. The apple tree moved slightly in the wind, bare branches, patient, holding the shape of all the springs that had already come, and all the springs still ahead of it. Inside the barn behind them, the Quonset hut stood as it had always stood, curved and certain and warm. Built from knowledge passed through hands that had cared enough to write it down, and hands that had cared enough to follow it, and hands that would carry it forward into whatever came next. The door should open wider when the storm is bigger. It always had. It always would. If you are facing your own storm right now, wherever you are, whatever form it has taken, remember her. Remember what she built from nothing but knowledge and refusal, and the instructions her father left her in a notebook buried under a barn floor. Remember who she opened the door for when they came knocking in the dark. The skills you need are already inside you, and the door should always open wider.